Thank you very much, sir. All right. Thank you all very much for coming and for tearing yourself away from the coffee break. I appreciate it. I will do my best to make it worth it. My team at Meta coordinates our work across the company to track and counter adversarial threat actors. Any determined threat actor that is looking to manipulate public debate, target users, or cause harm across the internet. We track a wide range of threats. 5 that I think are particularly relevant for this group are on the screen here. Broadly, you'll see that there are a couple that are about influence, about manipulating public discussion, espionage, which is about hacking, compromising the accounts of target users or surveillance, scams and clickbait, as I think we all know, some of the most adversarial actors we face are in fact scammers, and emerging harms, coordinated networks that are working together to drive other types of significant harm across our platforms and across the internet, which could include brigading or coordinated harassment. You'll note when you look at these that they span both what you would generally consider to be trust and safety threats and cybersecurity threats. The teams are actually structured to think about these together because while they're often discussed as 2 distinct types of challenges, the truth is they have one very important factor in common, which is they're both adversarial. There are behind them determined threat actors that are going to systemically be looking not just to stay ahead of defenders, but to exploit what defenders do, right? Simple example at a platform, you see that a lot of users are losing access to their accounts. You build a flow to make it so users can regain access to their accounts. And as everyone here knows immediately, the first thing that happens is adversaries try to exploit that flow to take over the same accounts you are trying to protect. You have this fundamental cycle. Anytime we're talking about an adversarial space, I'm sure everyone in this room has heard 1,000,000 times the most common phrase used, which is the attacker has the advantage online. This is said over and over again and is sort of an anchoring concept for a lot of our discussion, and I suspect a lot of discussions that everyone here has. When we talk about the advantage that an attacker has online, often this is used to sort of frame why we're so far behind, why it's so hard to tackle online threats, why the attacker is so effective and aggressive. And basically what we're talking about there is surprise and speed, right? Attackers get to move first, which means defenders are on their back foot. In the same way that when you play a game of chess, the player with the white pieces gets to move first, the player with the black pieces has to wait and react, so you're always reacting. This is one of these very common narratives, and it's used to frame a very dark world. I want to talk not about that, but the other side of the coin, which is the defender advantage, which I think we radically undersell. And we miss the fact that while attackers have advantages online, defenders have advantages too. And if you explore what that means, you'll find actually that the defender advantage, I would argue, it's not just that we can counter threat actors, but when it's done right, it is substantially stronger than surprise and speed. I want to explain why a little bit here. Obviously, this is a brief talk, so all I'm really trying to do is start the conversation. Would love to talk further about this afterwards if people have any questions or thoughts. The first thing I will say, though, is when you talk about countering adversarial threats, no single institution can counter these alone. You have to have a whole of society response. And in particular, you have 4 communities that are really critical to this effort. Industry, the tech platforms, governments, the media, and civil society. The reason these 4 communities matter so much is that each of them bring different tools to the field and can help exploit defender advantage in different ways. This conference is particularly valuable, I think, because it brings all 4 of the communities together. When we talk about defender advantage, here's what I mean. Attackers have a one-off advantage. They can exploit surprise to use a novel technique, and they can do it fast. Defenders have network advantages. And what I mean by that is, over time, we can build in responses to multiple operations and across society, not just to counter one threat actor, but to counter every threat actor that comes after them and tries to use a similar technique. You remember that analogy about chess. The player with the white pieces gets to go first every time. But you don't become a great chess player in one game. You become a great chess player in thousands of games, where you learn more and more about how to control the board and how to tackle the player you're playing against. And when we focus on the attacker advantage, we're focusing on individual operations, as opposed to the broader arc of countering these threats. From a defender perspective, we can build defenses over time that make things harder and harder for the adversary. And over time, that network advantage of a defender is better. It is greater than the one-off advantage that attackers have. One example of this that I think cuts across a bunch of different fields that we've seen a lot of discussion of lately is this idea of public disclosure as deterrence. Right? There's been a lot of discussion of the use of this technique in the lead up to and since the invasion of Ukraine by a range of European governments and the United States. This is a very effective tool. It's not a one-off advantage. It actually builds over time. And I want to use this example to start the conversation, right? First of all, public disclosure as deterrence, it's not about stopping bad actors from doing what they're going to do. It's about degrading their capabilities to make them less effective when they do it. So if you expect that someone is going to run an influence operation, if you know what the narrative they're going to land is, and you publicize that and the fact that that operation is coming if you do it right, you make that operation less effective when they try to do it. If you know that a threat actor is targeting a particular community, maybe with a phishing attack, or for exploit with a particular exploit, and you warn that community and get them to take steps to protect themselves, you make that operation less effective. And the interesting thing about this is you don't just make that operation less effective. You make every other future operation that tries to use the same technique less effective too. The third thing that public disclosure as deterrence does is it empowers defenders. The more information we can share systemically and thoughtfully, the more defender teams you can build up around the world that can tackle these threats. One of the biggest differences between countering influence operations in 2016 and today is that today there are determined expert teams across all four of those communities: industry, government, civil society, and the media, working to tackle these threats. And they're doing it together. That is a very big change. And one of the reasons for that is the systemic disclosure we've seen from government teams, from civil society teams that have sought out these campaigns and exposed it, from industry teams like at Meta, like at Twitter, and like at Google. Not just sharing high-level descriptions, but tactical analysis, TTPs, things that make defenders more and more effective. Each time you do this, you are empowering the entire society that is defending this, and it makes all future operations less effective, and it makes defenders more effective. This is a really good example of exploiting the defender advantage. One of the ways we do this, the main way we do this, is with our threat reports. We've been reporting on operations we take down for about 4 years now. We've done nearly 200 public reports of different operations. We now do these quarterly. If you haven't seen them, the last one came out in April. The next one's coming out next month. I would encourage you to take a look. The idea is to build this systemic reporting over time, share information about the operations we're seeing, empower defenders, and impose cost on bad actors. And that's the last point I'll mention about this, which is you can deter bad actors by doing this if you do this right. You just have to understand who the threat actors are and what deterrence means. For example, we've seen a rise in surveillance for hire and disinfo for hire operations over the last couple of years. These are generally legitimate businesses that have an illegitimate side business selling to far less responsible actors trying to make money. If someone has a legitimate and an illegitimate business, and you disclose their illegitimate business, you hold their legitimate business at risk. That can be a very effective deterrent. If a government holds itself out as a legitimate player, but also engages in deceptive techniques, and you expose that, you can make it harder for them to continue to play on the global field. That's a deterrent. And for some threat actors, the way you deter them is just by making them look foolish. Russia is a really good topic of conversation here. They're not concerned about getting called out, but they are concerned about looking ineffective. And when their operations get identified and get disclosed, for multiple years, earlier and earlier, reaching fewer and fewer audiences, they don't look that powerful. That is a deterrent too. So let me talk about ways you can see this type of defender advantage across the society that I mentioned. For platforms, public disclosures, I think, is an important component of this, and it's obviously a piece we focus on. The other piece to call out here is where I say adversarial design. In a very real way, one of the biggest advantages we have as defenders is that increasingly these threats play out across the terrain of the internet, the social media platforms, the different connected platforms that we have built. And we as defenders, platforms and industry, can change that terrain to make it more resilient to bad actors and easier for defenders over time, right? Again, if we imagine that chess analogy, imagine you play against another player and you see them use the same opening over and over again. So in the next game, you change the board and you put a river across the section they usually advance through. That's something that actually defenders can do and the platforms can do. My favorite example of this, which goes back in time a little bit but I think is relevant, we obviously all saw threat actors use advertising to try to influence public debate ahead of the 2016 elections. In response to that, we built a whole series of controls around advertising to make it harder to exploit. In particular, we required that if you want to run political ads in a country, you have to prove that you're from the country you're targeting. We saw a range of threat actors try to defeat these controls. In my favorite example, we saw a threat actor try to hire a criminal organization to run ads for them in hopes that that would beat the controls we have in place. They hired a spamming organization from Nigeria, and the organization took their money and never ran the ads. You'd think they would have seen that coming. This is the type of control you can impose on these actors. They spend all their time trying to defeat the defenses rather than running the operation. And so I think that this idea of changing the terrain is really important, and it's one of the most powerful things that platforms bring to the playing field. Governments have an extremely important role here as well, and regulation is especially critical, because regulation is just as much a part of the terrain of conflict as the platforms themselves. One really good example of this, we increasingly see threat actors using grayer and grayer manipulation techniques. We see more domestic actors engaged in influence, and we see actors trying to look 90% authentic, 99% authentic. What is the line they can push? In a domestic context, in a context with actors doing this, one of the most important constraints is clear regulation that signals what is legitimate public debate and what is manipulation. Wherever there is grayness, they will exploit this, and you can eliminate some of that with careful regulation. Another really good example, you can deter bad actors. Again, if we think about those surveillance for hire companies, right? If you impose your customer requirements, if you impose requirements on responsible sale and development of these tools, you make life harder for them. Not just one threat actor, but the entire type of threat actor. And in doing this, I think it's particularly important that democracies lead. And the reason for that is we don't want autocracies defining what constitutes legitimate public debate and engagement on the internet. They're very happy to do that, and we're already seeing autocracies around the world try to do that. So I think it's particularly important that democracies lead in this space. Third, civil society. The particularly well-represented community here brings a number of different skills to bear that government and industry don't have. One of the most important is the ability to run cross-platform investigations. We've seen influence operations that touch 300 platforms online. Largely, these do not just target one anymore. And to bring specific regional and topical expertise and context that larger players might not have at the start. Another really key component is legitimacy. I know this may surprise some people, but industry and government are not always the most trusted communities at the moment. Civil society brings a different perspective and a different reservoir of trust. And that's incredibly important in exposing campaigns where we know threat actors are trying to play on that distrust. And so civil society has a really important role to play there. Media is also an incredibly important player. There's some overlap with things that civil society can do, but a couple of the key things to add here are the ability to speak to the victims of these campaigns and make them human. We saw earlier the panel speaking with journalists and people who'd been targeted by NSO Group and this surveillance for hire. It changes the entire conversation, and it can galvanize response, which is incredibly powerful. This is balanced with a tricky requirement, which is how do you report on and disclose operations like these without falling into the hyperbole trap, where you end up amplifying them and doing the threat actors' work for them. But there's a balance to strike there, and when you strike it, what you can do is not just expose a particular operation, but you can build awareness around an entire type of threat, and then galvanize more response by governments, by platforms, and by others. So there's a feedback loop between all 4 of these communities. So we pull all this together, and I started with this idea of the attacker advantage, right, which everyone has heard a million times. The key thing to be aware of is this is a very fast advantage. You can exploit it quickly. You don't have to coordinate with anyone. You come up with a new idea, and you run it as quickly as you can. But it's one-off. It scales linearly. You come up with an idea and you exploit it, you get this much run out of it. You have to come up with another idea, and then you keep trying to do that. The defender advantage, on the other hand, is harder. It requires more partnership and trust. You have to have that whole of society collaboration to make it work. But when you do it, you get both specific and systemic deterrence. You deter a specific threat actor, but you also build in controls to make it so that every threat actor that comes after them has to work harder for less gain, and that every defender can work a little bit easier and be more impactful. And so what I would argue when we look and sort of take a step back is that this dwelling on the attacker advantage has blinded us a bit to the powers that we all have. They're very different, but when you play the field right and we work together, they're far more effective than what defenders can bring to bear. And if we look in the influence operations space, we can see some of this. Because today, influence operations are caught faster, they reach fewer people than in 2016, significantly. We see threat actors continuing to try, and they will always try, but we also see them working hard for less gain. That is what the defender advantage looks like. Now, as I was saying, this is just a sort of brief teaser to start the conversation. I'm trying to frame out how there's this other side to the coin, and now I think we have opportunities that we don't always realize and aren't as fully explored. I'd love to talk more about it. If people have any questions, please come up to me, other members of the team, or anyone else, and we'd love to discuss further. Thank you all so much. That's all I got.